Welcome to Wind Down Wednesday. Here are your hosts, Jeffrey Tobias Halter and Amanda Hammett.
Well, good afternoon. Today is my pleasure to bring back Meredith Moore and continue talking about women, power dynamics, and actually women's history with money. I'm Jeffrey Tobias Halter, and today I'm enjoying a nice, refreshing rosé on a hot summer day here in Atlanta. Amanda, what's your beverage of choice today?
I am with my Old Faithful today. I have got my club soda and vodka, which is my traditional afternoon drink. All right. So it is my honor today to welcome Meredith Moore back to Wind Down Wednesday. If you missed her first episode, you got to go check it out. She gives some really great data points and just some 1, 2, 3. You need to do this monthly, quarterly, yearly. Go check it out. So let's just dive into her and her background. So Meredith actually brings a passion for lifelong learning to her role as the founder and CEO of Artisan Financial Strategies. She's a subject matter expert in women and money, focusing on women breadwinners and how this can impact personal relationships. She is also one of the only public survivors of glioblastoma or brain cancer. In her words, having kicked its ass for 17 years after being diagnosed 6 weeks after having her son. She holds a bachelor's of industrial and systems engineering from Georgia Tech and is a 2017 graduate of Leadership Atlanta and a 2021 Atlanta Business Chronicle Women of Influence honoree. Meredith has spoken at over a dozen Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 women ERGs, the Wall Street Journal, Women in the Workplace event, and on the Wall Street Journal's Secrets of Women of Wealth podcast. Her articles on power dynamics of money have also been published and quoted in publications such as Forbes, U.S. News and World Report, Retirement Daily, Medium, and Thrive Global.
Meredith, welcome back to Wind Down Wednesday. What's your beverage of choice today?
Again, I love my California Pinot Noirs. Again, I get that fruity essence on it. I'm not a wine snob. I wish I could say that I was. And again, it's not beneath me to do a little night Blackhawk or something, which is a box wine. So I know that's gauche, but I'm going to go ahead and out myself with that today.
I love it. I love it. So let's dive in, Meredith. Earlier this year, you shared a YouTube video that outlined the history of women and money. For those of you who have not seen it, we will be linking it in on mine and Jeffrey's websites, YouTube, the whole shebang. You will be able to find this. But let's start at the beginning. First of all, what led you to create the video? What were you actually hoping to learn? And who did it go to? So let's just get a general overview here.
So in 2017, I was really trying to unpack the whole systematize, why are there power dynamics issues? How did this women breadwinner thing even come about? And so I'm a history buff. Actually, my son is a history buff too. And so I really did everything. I did all this research to understand any historical points that had anything to do with law around women and money. And what I came to, and we'll hit on what some of those key dates were, but it led me to why we are where we are culturally. I mean, I really believe that history tells us that, and really to be able to look back. So do you want me to hit on what I found some of those key points?
Go for it.
Yep. So, and all of this is kind of why we are where we are. So women couldn't even own property until 1939. And go figure, of course, it was more liberal in New York than, of course, it was in the South, even at that time. But a lot of this stuff really started happening in New York first. It wasn't until the 1960s, which wasn't so long ago, that women could even have a bank account in every U.S. state. And what's shocking and what most people don't know, it really wasn't until the 80s or 90s where women could even get a business loan. They had to have a male co-signature. And that could be a minor age son. My son is 17, and it's appalling to me that I would have to have him co-sign a loan for my own business. And by the way, this isn't just me. Of course, this is a legal thing, but I have clients that are boomers that went through the same thing. They would have to get a male partner if they weren't married, I mean, it was problematic, like how to find somebody to co-sign. So, and it's back to also, I even remember when I was at Georgia Tech, there was a thing called the MRS degree, which is exactly what you would think. Like they were there to get married, but they were bright. And I'm like, why would you put yourself through doing an engineering degree only to try to find a husband? But that's just me. That's a lot of extra math and science that I wouldn't want to do. But, it's these points on property ownership and bank accounts. And if you think about it, we model a lot of our behaviors after the parents, the moms who raised us. And, in that time, like a lot of them didn't even expect to work, especially if they didn't have degrees and they didn't grow up like that. So we model our behaviors that way. And so really, and you and Jeff probably know the data better than I do, but it wasn't until the 80s to where, the numbers started really shooting up to where women were going back into the workforce. And so, the whole concept of breadwinning for women, by the way, that is not a term that men or women like. It wasn't shocking to me that men didn't like it, but women like it even less, by the way, this is a research thing, but it's a real thing. But I think the legal gives us sort of a context to understand why, again, this delegation sort of theory happens, especially in households where she is a high earner. Again, this is not the case. Let me also say this is not the case for everybody. I know a lot of people where she handles all the money and he doesn't touch it. But if we're talking about breadwinning for women, that's what creates the power dynamics. And as she's earning more, this concept of let him handle it. I'm going to go make bank at my job. And it's done in the spirit of efficiency. In answer to your question, so I ended up writing an article that I did after I had done all this research, which led to this sort of animation video that I think you're referring to. And I always like to have fun and create different content. And I just put that out on my YouTube channel and to really show people in a more fun way, like why the history was where it is.
So great history in the video. You talked a little bit on our last show, but I'd like to fast forward now to 2022. Mm-hmm. Give us a contemporary view and even touch on some of the things from our first show for the listeners who haven't heard that yet. A contemporary view of women and money. And then you also talk about women as primary breadwinner, but also a lot of single households being led by women with no spouse in the room. So give us this contemporary snapshot.
Right. So what we're seeing is, and my belief is the two key things are going to be financial education and going to be engagement. In the spirit of time, a lot of people may say, well, I don't have time to engage, or I don't have time to engage deeply. My theory is around more, how do we, in any relationship, if you're going to be in a relationship in 10 years, we might as well create context. Context now is, how do you create a baseline in your own finances and knowing what's going on? I laid out a meeting cadence, a weekly, a monthly, a quarterly, and annual cadence on very set things to do. And by engaging in that, and I'm happy to go back through that, but that enables you to be engaged in your own finances and how to create better transparency as you happen to have a relationship. And to be able to have better conversations. 2 points that I think you also might be referring to is it's important to note that when you have in a relationship, if you do what we call the partial pooling model of cash flow, which is the his, hers, and the ours account, which is what I see most frequently, it's been proven that her discretionary money tends to be more spent on the household and kids, where his tends to be more spent on sort of toys. And it's also been proven that as she's earning more and more, the amount of housework does not reduce at the same level as the earnings go up. And so it's, how do we have that conversation? Are those back to cultural norms historically left over? But again, in answer to your question, Jeff, I believe the greater the transparency in creating again, a meeting cadence on very specific financial items to do as a couple is what will lead ultimately to success, better conversations, less judgment, and sort of more cohesion around financial goals and how to work together for success.
That's really interesting. Meredith, can you share with us what kind of conversations has this video sparked?
On the history you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's led itself back to what I was alluding to is, has the law created the culture? Mm-hmm. And look, I am in speaking engagements, there's always a few hands where they're like, that isn't my experience. And so, I asterisk and say, you know what, she may handle all the finances, but I think what we haven't touched on, and I do want to say this, it's considered a cultural norm. If she's in the C-suite, her husband stays at home. Like, this is a very, very common occurrence, and nobody talks about it. And nobody knows about it. That might be more in middle management, but this is a common occurrence. And I've had multiple calls from women in senior leadership, C-suite. They're struggling with this. Like, this is like, hey, I feel guilty. I know that I shouldn't do this. And we're all hung up on like, who's supposed to be at home and who's not. And I'm making this money. And this is this makes all the sense intellectually and practically, but values, it wasn't how we were all necessarily raised.
So part of this show, at the end of our last show, I teased out all this tremendous wealth that women are going to be inheriting. And so we've got this video that kind of talks about the history of women and money. As a futurist, as someone who talks about women and money, give us a snapshot of the next 10 years.
Yep. So here's what we're seeing right now is there, and some of financial law has occurred that's going to make this in some ways worse. So the bulk of the assets that sit out there that are about to be passed from women are in qualified plans or think retirement accounts. Now, how that works is typically somebody's going to pass those monies to the spouse. To your point, Jeff, men tend to die before women. Women have a lot more longevity. The other big social issue that's way, way on our radar is needing extended care. A lot of people, if they're not prepared for retirement, they're definitely not prepared for healthcare costs, long-term care costs. And many people haven't bought the insurance to pay for it. We have a client paying $15,000 a month right down the street from my office. And that's not uncommon. And so it's a lot of this stuff is going to get wiped out, I'm thinking, because of women living longer, unless the healthcare issue has been addressed. What I also see, and probably a lot of your listeners are in this case, our generation has done better than our parents. And ultimately, we don't want to see mom go to the Medicaid nursing home, but we're going to cash flow it so mom can stay in her house or go to the nice assisted living, which impacts our cash flow statement. So I see healthcare and people running out of money because they didn't save enough for what as you all know, I don't like the term retirement. I call it work optional because we work because we want to, not because we have to, but enough hasn't been saved. The other thing that's important legislatively that has happened is now when we pass IRAs down to a non-spouse, say a child, a niece, a nephew, they have to take all that money out over 10 years, which forces a very big, potentially very large tax event. And that law was recently changed. It used to be where you could stretch that out and take that money out over a longer period of time and pay the taxes at a slower run. Now it's like, boom, 10 years and you got to pay all those taxes. So I see, as a futurist, the issue of the IRAs being the bulk of what's going to get passed down, that's an issue. Healthcare costs are a major, major issue. In fact, state of Washington actually made a tax if you did not purchase long-term care insurance. They're still kind of testing some of that to see how that played out. It is state of Washington. So for whatever that's worth, it's been interesting to see that. But the reality is women live longer. And living longer, women tend to need care, not that men don't. I always like to hear is my long-term care strategy is a bullet to my head. That is not an uncommon quote that I hear from people. But the reality is these things happen. My grandparents lived to 96 and 98. I have 3 clients in their 90s that are still alive. This stuff happens. And again, if you don't get hit by the proverbial bus or something happened earlier, the reality is if you live long enough, you're just going to need care. And if how do we have better conversations with our parents? Like, try not to vomit as you're listening to this podcast, but who wants to go have a family meeting with your parents to see how prepared they are financially? Nobody does. That doesn't mean it's not important to do, because if something happens to them, is it going to become upon you and your income to cover it because you don't want to see certain things happen? That's an uncomfortable conversation, but that is a real conversation that needs to be had. I have a client, her dad always told her they were financially secure. Everything was good, the whole 9. And he passed away. Turns out they had nothing. So mom was only living on Social Security and they had to foreclose on the house. And so the daughter is in C-suite. So she's financially having to cover everything. So back to money's uncomfortable, money's yucky, there's shame around it, all this stuff. It's like, how do we have better conversations? How do we take this charged aspect to it out so we can all plan better and not make it so taboo?
Well, Meredith, you gave us a lot to think about. I mean, I think that a lot of us are in this situation where we've got parents to consider. We've got the power dynamics at home. What are we passing on to our own children? What is that going to look like? So these are all conversations that probably you're right. Most people are avoiding, but we should be having them. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And thank you so much for making us think about these things that we kind of want to push under the rug a lot of times. So thank you guys thank you to our audience for joining us again today. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed being with you guys.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm Jeffrey Tobias Halter. Thank you for joining us this week for Wind Down Wednesday.
Thank you for joining us for Wind Down Wednesday. If you like this episode, please subscribe to receive more episodes straight to your inbox.